Okay, so hello. Thank you again for having me. I'm really pleased to be able to be here this evening. As Samaya said, my name's Edward. I think I know a lot of people on the call today, but I'm a lecturer at the University of Exeter. I've been involved in some recent events in the past. So if my name rings a bell, it might be to do with me sitting in the background and kind of lurking at the early events. I have slipped in that respect, and I'm keen to get back involved. So thanks for giving me the chance to speak here today. Also, thanks for anybody who's not involved with Reason who's here. As we said, this talk was originally meant to happen separately from Reason during Neurodiversity Celebration Week at the University of Exeter as part of the sort of nationwide celebration week. But I'm really grateful to have a chance to present this here today, now that I've bounced back from the rather nasty cold that kind of knocked me for six first time around. So I'm going to be wearing two hats today. And hopefully, if you take nothing else away from the sort of the next 20, 25 minutes or so, it will be the notion that these two hats, different and perhaps irreconcilable as they might seem, can be worn together at the same time. My first hat is my neurodivergent hat. As you've probably seen from my bio, and as you may have been able to tell from the selection of Airfix kits in the background there, I'm autistic. And a fair chunk of my teaching work at Exeter actually revolves around supporting autistic students as they transition from school to university. This is a really fun job, by the way, and probably the only one I have ever had where I can legitimately match student support roles to the cast of the Muppets and also call it work. I did actually do that. I also, though, have a second hat, and it's my medieval hat. I'm not going to keep these hats on for very long, so if anyone wants to screenshot this and plaster it all over the internet, you've got about 5 seconds. I work very broadly on the cultural and social history of medieval Europe between about 1000 AD and about 1500 AD, particularly French language and literature. And today I'd like to try and bring these two hats together in some kind of glorious Technicolor combination. I don't want to claim to be doing anything massively revolutionary here, nor can I claim to have any huge field transforming insights, partly because this is a new area of inquiry for me and I'm trying to map the field out a bit. I'd welcome any thoughts, comments, suggestions, or carrier pigeons from anybody, specialists in neurodiversity, medieval studies, both or neither. And I will try and hang around, as well as after the end of the talk, on the Reason Discord for the next few days, just to pick up on any conversations that that might spark off. So fundamentally, my goal for today then is to ask two big questions, or rather to poke two big questions with a stick and see what swarms of insight come out of the inevitable hornet's nest that I'm going to stir up. The first question is how we might apply concepts of neurodiversity in the classic sense of thinking differently. So as an umbrella term that incorporates divergent neurotypes like autism, where most of my focus is today, ADHD and dyslexia, and how we might apply that to the pre-modern world. The second question is a bit more fundamental than that, and it's the one I'm going to take second. Is it helpful, or indeed is it ethical to actually do that? As you can probably guess, my answer to both of these two questions is a very qualified yes / we can / we should. I'm coming down on the positive side here, and I'll go into more detail about this later on. I'm also more than happy, I saw someone ask about slides being shared. I'm more than happy to share those slides as well, so don't hesitate to get in touch. Well, where to start then when thinking about medieval neurodivergence? One of the great things about being a medievalist is that my presentations are always chock full of pretty pictures. And when you're working with medieval manuscripts, every picture tells its own story. Very few manuscripts are quite as elaborate as the ones you see at the start of Disney movies, such as these four, which have, and I'm going to put on my medievalist hat for a minute here, elaborate decorated initials, full-page miniatures, and in this last case, a highly unusual mix of capital and minuscule letter forms. Incidentally, bragging rights to anyone who has a special interest in Disney films and who can name all 4 of the films featured here in the chat, go right ahead. Images like these, which sort of form part of my job somehow, are inspired from somewhere though. And there are a large number of medieval manuscripts, particularly of the better known texts, that are illustrated. And this is where I started when I was thinking about representations of neurological difference in medieval culture, because just like every copy of a manuscript text that is a text written by hand is unique, the illustrations in the more lavish manuscripts that I've worked with are by definition unique as well, and are often the product of illustrators who are responding to the text in front of them. So as a window into the medieval mindset, they are really, really fascinating tools to work with. I mention all of this and the sort of slight sideline on medieval manuscripts in my day job there, because the image that I've pressed into service as publicity for this whole presentation is from a fairly well-known text in medieval studies, and one, funnily, that Disney has got quite a few films out of. Specifically, it's this one, and it shows an episode from what's known as the Vulgate cycle, a lengthy series of anonymous prose texts from the early 13th century that brought together and expanded upon many of the tales of King Arthur and his court that were already circulating across Europe by this point. Essentially, and this is actually the analogy that I use with undergraduates, the Arthurian world at this point is basically the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So characters pop up in various guises, they team up with each other, they're being purposed and repurposed in all sorts of combinations to various didactic and narrative ends. So it's a massive kind of world with which the anonymous authors did a lot of thinking about culture more broadly, so to speak. The episode here is from the longest part of the Vulgate cycle, the prose Lancelot, which, as the name suggests, focuses mostly on Lancelot. He's the guy on the right in the image here, the guy in just the nightshirt. And I'm pretty sure he doesn't look how you might think he would look when you think of the word Lancelot. And there's a reason for this. In the text at this point, Lancelot's gone to seek a companion of his called Galahad at his castle in Sorolois. But what he doesn't know is that Galahad himself has gone out effectively questing. So when Lancelot arrives and finds that Galahad's not there, Lancelot's reaction is something that the text that's being illustrated here comments on in great detail. I've translated it. There's no requirement to know any medieval French for this, but this is my translation. When Lancelot turns up in Sorolois, he's received with all the joy in the world, but he can't find Galahad. And Lancelot's really upset by this, and he's not certain he can actually remain within his wits. So the next we hear of him, he appears to Galahad's men at midnight, wearing only his nightshirt and his stockings, and his anguish has caused his nose to bleed. It doesn't say how. He'd bled almost a spoonful of blood at this point. I'd suggest that it's not too much of a stretch here to read Lancelot's response to this here through a neurodivergent lens. This is not the only reading you could make, but it's certainly one that you can make, specifically an autistic lens. Something, when I read this, certainly something akin to almost a shutdown. Faced with a strong emotional upheaval, Lancelot reacts equally strongly. He feels this great anguish, cuts himself from others, and behaves in a fashion that's coded as socially unacceptable in response to this change. The illustration as a response to the text is particularly revealing here, as they go further than the text does in showing Lancelot quite literally distancing himself from the rest of the courtly society that surrounds him. I particularly like the guy second from the left here, kind of going, have you seen this guy? What's he doing? You know, which is a feeling that many of us may empathize with. There's a second, much later illustration of the same episode, which offers another perspective on Lancelot's actions here. While the text frames Lancelot's behavior through the lens of how other people see it, Lancelot appearing to Galahad's men and so on and so forth in this nightshirt, the right-hand image, which is from a manuscript about a century and a half later of the same text, only shows us Lancelot, which basically puts the reader of the manuscript in the role of onlooker, as we see him making his escape effectively from Sorolois, complete there with the nosebleed that he's given himself. So we can read this episode like a shutdown, But we do need to be careful about drawing generalized conclusions here. Lancelot isn't exactly the everyman character in Arthurian legend. His adoptive mother, and the one who cures him of this particular episode, is none other than the Lady of the Lake. And his relationship with Galaor is not just any relationship. It's much closer and deeper than that with other Knights of the Round Table. His quote-unquote madness also serves a narrative function in bringing him back into the court at Camelot a little bit later. So it's possible that I'm reading a little too much into this. Madness, though, is only one way in which neurodivergent traits are framed in medieval literature. And we don't actually have to look that far to find another. In fact, even within the Arthurian canon, there's another knight, Percival, who's been the subject of a published reading through a neurodivergent lens that this time focuses less on madness and more on foolishness. The next slide, by the way, is indebted heavily to the work of Paula Leveridge. So I'll treat this example a little bit more briefly. So to look at what Paula Leveridge says in more detail, she argues that in the first version of Percival's own story, which is attributed to an author called Chrétien de Troyes in the later 12th century, Percival specifically is shown as lacking a theory of mind. More generally here, he shows a propensity to retreat into a world of his own and never stays in one place for long, among other examples I could cite. I'll give two specific examples of Leveridge's argument before engaging with it in a bit more detail. The first comes from early in the text, where Percival's just left his mother's tutelage to become a knight. And his mother's advice to him is still ringing in his ears, particularly the bit that says he should serve ladies when he meets them. Percival gets this catastrophically wrong with the first lady he meets, basically being far too forward, which Leveridge reads as him effectively misinterpreting and following too strictly the advice that his mother gives him in a fashion that, for Leveridge at least, is coded as autistic. You can see in the quote I provided there, you have Percival effectively insisting on the fact that his mother's told him he must act in this way, and he's therefore doing it and repeating that again and again and again. He's described here as Nisus, and the young man who was Nis, ignorant of himself, which is a very semantically loaded term, of course. But Leveridge's point here is that he doesn't understand the nuances of his mother's teachings. He doesn't quite bring shame upon the young woman in the way that his mother warns him against, but he does show a particular regard to the ring that she's wearing, and indeed simply takes it as he thinks his mother has told him to do. The second example is more significant, and this is where the image on the left comes into play. This involves Percival seeing the actual Holy Grail as it's paraded before him, but failing to ask the crucial question, who's this Grail for? That would have led to the character of the Fisher King being healed. And the quote there is in two parts. The first part is effectively what I've just described. The second part is him being admonished for not asking that question the following morning. Leveridge sums both of these episodes, the first lady he meets and the Grail episode, up in a rather pithy sentence that does do a lot of work, I think, suggesting that his lack of ability to read his mother's gestures and her mental state is, and I'm quoting here, the same cognitive deficiency, bear with me, that prevents him from engaging in the social exchange of question and answer. Beyond those specific cases, though, that Leveridge looks at, it's her rationale for doing this sort of analysis that is essentially anachronistic, that I find particularly interesting. Essentially, she takes theory of mind, the idea that one is able to attribute or not able to attribute feelings and actions to another person, as a tool for analysing a literary text, and takes two conclusions from it. First, that we can read diverse scenes from the text together through theory of mind. That's the first quote that I've underlined there. And secondly, that using theory of mind opens up a unifying theme, that of communication, which allows us to draw new conclusions from the text. Now, there are many issues with making an argument such as this, and I can already hear people clamoring to shout them out. The first is that this kind of argument does make a claim to sort of give a single unifying framework for a body of text that are basically built on not being a single unified whole. And the second, of course, is that it relies very heavily on the notion of theory of mind, which, since that article was published in 2011, has come under increasing criticism from many neurodiversity advocates, including, I suspect, many people in this virtual room. But even if the specific lenses that I've looked at thus far, with the help of Paula Leveridge, so shutdowns, theory of mind, and other neurodivergent coded ideas, have their issues, this dive into Arthurian literature that I've tried to spend the first part of this talk doing has suggested two things, I think, regarding the practice of attributing neurodivergent traits to figures from the pre-modern world. And even if you were a bit lost in the details there of Arthuriana, hopefully I can bring you back with this sort of neat little summary. The first thing is that you can make a case for individuals in pre-modern texts being what we would today call neurodivergent, and specifically thus far autistic. The second point, more obviously, is that people do. The case of Percival with Leveridge there is the obvious example for that second point. But to shift focus for the second half of this talk, once you broaden the search for medieval neurodivergence beyond the kind of material that I look at in my day job, so beyond literary texts, away from the reified realms of chivalric romance, and start to take a peek at historical figures, you open up a real Pandora's box. I'll leave this up for a second. As many of us may know, there is something of a cottage industry online in speculating about what life would have been like for neurodivergent individuals in the past. Just a cursory Google search for a term like medieval autism or medieval ADHD turns up a range of speculation, as you can see here, that's often actually, when you go and look at the responses to it, it's the start of some really interesting, if ultimately kind of unsourced and unprovable conversations. There's a fascinating contrast here, though, between this sort of broad brush, non-specific approach and more quote-unquote academic works, which tend to be less personally motivated and focus on individual case studies in a manner not unlike what I've done earlier with the two figures of Lancelot and Percival. To look at a couple of examples, the Journal of Medical Biography is, as you might expect, particularly assiduous in this respect. Yeah, that's four. Three of them, I think, written partly by the same person. Yep. Although there are plenty of other examples of this question of did X have Y, including Hildegard of Bingen. I love this title because ruminations is just the best word there in this context. A very well-known 12th century nun and polymath. To go post-medieval for a bit, Henry Cavendish. This is something that was first picked up by Oliver Saxon, which any of us who've read Steve Silverman's book Neurotribes will have seen as basically half of chapter 1. And to go further back in time still, Theophrastus, the ancient Greek poet, the work on the obtuse man, which is attributed here as a case of ADHD. Whether we're looking at literary figures or historical ones, though, individual questions like that, case studies, and the broader non-academic questioning that you see on sites like Tumblr and Twitter brush up against a bigger question. And it's one that I'd like to turn to in the final part of this talk. Excuse me. Brought to you by water. Yes, it is possible, as I say, to identify modern individuals as neurodivergent, or at least to draw parallels with neurodivergent traits. And indeed, academics and non-academics within and without literary studies routinely do. The question, though, is, and this is probably where I think this is going where I think you're imagining it's going, should we? Should we actually talk about pre-modern individuals being neurodivergent? Now, I should say at this point, is anyone in the audience an anthropologist, by the way? Feel free to comment. Failing that, is there anybody in the audience who's done the first year undergraduate medieval history module at the University of Exeter? Because you're going to recognize this citation. Okay. Questions about what we would today call retrospective diagnosis, like this, often end up caught in something of a methodological quagmire, caught between two approaches, the emic and the etic. This is summarized by Monica H. Green in the quote that I'll briefly look at here. The question is should the historian, so literary, cultural, or otherwise, try to reconstruct the world as it was perceived at the time? That's the emic approach, or is it better in whatever way to actually use modern frames of reference for this? The quote I've put up here, which basically says exactly that, is from a historian called Monica Green, who works on the Black Death specifically. Monica Green ultimately comes down on the side of the etic approach of using modern frames of reference, but that's mainly because modern frames of reference can easily be applied in Black Death scholarship. Specifically, as people might know, recent advantages in genetic research have allowed us to find DNA evidence of Yersinia pestis in the tooth pulp of plague victims. So there's no risk of anachronism there, effectively, if you do that kind of etic approach. This is obviously a very specific advance to plague science and doesn't translate to neurodivergence very well. You can't infer neurodivergence from digging someone up, and you certainly can't do it right now from DNA, nor perhaps in the context of the Spectrum 10K project, should you try to. Instead, as you might imagine, the trend in the humanities has been towards the emic approach, where we place the focus on understanding the lived experience of people in the past with reference to the world they lived in, without imposing any anachronistic and distorting perceptions, as people say, from the present day. Essentially, this is understanding the past on its own terms. One good piece of advocacy for this tread softly kind of approach in a medieval context comes from the work of Eliza Burer, who points out that someone being dyslexic would have mattered very little in the medieval world, where literacy is neither widespread nor expected. And that last word, expected, is particularly useful, I think, in emphasizing that modern day diagnoses are, of course, situational. In the medical model of disability, dyslexia is pathologized today precisely because of how widespread the technology of writing and the practice of literacy have become. To give a more specific example, Burer also notes that it's far too much of a simplification to conflate the concept of acedia with what we today would call inattentive ADHD. Yes, there are treatises in Life in a Monastery which describe acedia as a condition where the leisurely mind runs back and forth through everything, or as a sort of a wandering of the mind. And it's very tempting to sort of to jump in and say, inattentive ADHD, brilliant. But the audience for these texts on acedia was being held to a different and very specific set of monastic standards. By way of a summary, Burer puts forward something of a manifesto for this, one that acts as almost a call to arms, I think, for anyone interested in understanding the past on its own terms. And what she says is it doesn't make sense to try and reconstruct a history of learning difficulties by combing chronicles for distracted novices or dyslexic scribes, or trying to unearth modern concepts in medieval texts. Instead, what she sets out to do is to explore, she puts it, how people in the Middle Ages understood intellectual variance and the impediments that limit abilities to learn. We've seen some answers to that question already of how medieval people understood intellectual variance, both from Percival's niceness, this idea of not knowing himself, to broader concepts of foolishness. And it certainly is, I think, a methodologically sound and a very ethically informed approach. There are lots of individual answers to this question, and of course those case studies. And I'm very much aware that this is an area I could say a lot more about, and I'm happy to do so in a couple of minutes or so once I've finished this particular ramble. But part of me does feel as though we're losing something by not drawing on precisely the terminology, autism, dyslexia, ADHD, that's so important to many of us. Words like autism and dyslexia have power, and importantly, they have currency. A fact which I think all of the authors of the was X autistic papers I showed you earlier were implicitly aware of. And to come back to them again for just a moment, the conclusions that those was X autistic papers reach are better justified precisely because they engage with modern concepts surrounding neurodivergence. I mean, to give a single example, talking about the secondary function of somewhere like a monastery in providing a space where neurodiversity can thrive is an interesting analogy to make, right? And it's one that actually makes a historical point, that the mainstreaming of autistic individuals isn't necessarily as novel a concept as we think it might be. But of course, even those sources have to hedge their bets, stating that Hildegard of Bingen, for instance, displayed many of the criteria that would come to be viewed as diagnostic of Asperger's syndrome. What we're faced with here then, as we hold on this dramatic manuscript image of a conversation and then someone saying "but" on the side, I think is a challenge of how to reconcile the power of defining something and the importance that words have and the currency that modern terminology has, with an empathetic understanding of the past that recognizes the lived experience of individuals. There's also a strongly personal and you might say affective element here, and one that it would be dishonest of me not to mention. Simply put, I want to find my people in the history that I research. The medievalist Richard Utz has lamented that medieval studies as a discipline has tried to distance itself from some of the people who know most about the Middle Ages, the enthusiasts who take part in practices like live-action role-playing and who have exactly the same kind of personal engagement with the Middle Ages that's looked down upon in a lot of more traditional academic spheres. Engaged research is the solution that Richard Utz puts out to this problem. For him, it means lowering the drawbridge between academia and enthusiasts. But for me, looking at autistic medieval history, it might mean something closer to home. How can we recognize and acknowledge the fact that autistic people, by our standards, almost certainly existed in the Middle Ages, while still respecting and understanding the very different worldviews that informed how they were seen and how they saw themselves? That's the big question I'm going to end on today, and I'm going to suggest a possible answer to that, although it's by no means the only answer. One possible answer for this comes from queer history. As many of us might know, queer history has long had a very similar question when it talks about historical quote-unquote homosexuality. So like neurodivergence, medieval Europe didn't have the concept of homosexuality. So how can we talk about lived experience, for which there is ample evidence, without drowning in methodological caveats? I'd suggest that one way to do this might be to take a leaf out of Judith Bennett's work, and this is the person I'm quoting on the slide here, who coined the term lesbian-like back in 1990 as a way to, and this is where the quote is, participate in the creation of histories that can have meaning and to try and emancipate through history. Again, lesbian-like is not a perfect term for what Bennett's describing. It puts the focus on actions rather than identities, among other things. But it's concise and it acknowledges both the continuities and the breaks between the historical past and the present, well, the present. In fact, it was only in the very late stages of writing this article that I noticed the Theophrastus article I mentioned earlier, The Obtuse Man, does precisely this, talking about ADHD-like behavior in a manner that is more succinct and fluent for being able to say that. So to come back to my first example today, is that what we should call Lancelot? Is that what we should do when we're talking about individuals who we would today call neurodivergent? Are his actions autism-like, autism-adjacent, neurodivergence proximate? Maybe not that last one, actually, but I mean, I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts, both on, incidentally, the rather fascinating conversation in the chat about attempts to name all of the Disney films, and also on the slightly less complicated question of pre-modern neurodivergent identities. Thank you. Thanks very much.